Welcome back to Neurophysiology class with Dr. Perry. So today we have lecture 3 where we're going to discuss cranial nerves and autonomic nervous system. And because of these two subtopics that we are going to be discussing today, I'm going to split this lecture into two. So we'll spend maybe the first 30 minutes or so discussing cranial nerves, and then the other minutes we'll look at the autonomic nervous system. So with regard to cranial nerves, by now I believe that you've discussed cranial nerves in anatomy. So we're not going to spend much time because you've already discussed them in anatomy. So this is just revision to empower you as we start discussing the motor system, because they are also involved in motor function. So without wasting much time, let's start by looking at these cranial nerves. So the cranial nerves are considered components of the peripheral nervous system in terms of function. But although on a structural level, the olfactory, the optic, and the trigeminal nerves are more accurately considered part of the central nervous system. So in terms of structure or anatomy, you'll find that the cranial nerve number 1, 2, and 5, they are embedded within the brain tissue. So they are considered as part of the central nervous system. But all of these cranial nerves, they are emerging directly from the brain or the brain stem itself. So there are two cranial nerves that will directly connect to the cerebrum, and these are olfactory and optic, cranial nerve number 1 and 2. Then the cranial nerve number 3 and 4, 3 being the oculomotor and 4 being the trochlear nerve, these are emerging from the midbrain. And then the other 4 are emerging from the pons. And these are trigeminal nerve, which is cranial nerve number 5, abducens nerve, the cranial nerve number 6, and the facial nerve, the cranial nerve number 7. So these are emerging from the pons. So from the pons, you have cranial nerve number 5, cranial nerve number 6, cranial nerve number 7, which is the facial nerve, and the cranial nerve number 8, which is called the vestibulocochlear nerve. And this vestibulocochlear nerve is also referred to as acoustic nerve. So these 4 cranial nerves are emerging from the pons, and the other 4 are emerging from the medulla oblongata. And these are cranial nerve number 9, which is the glossopharyngeal, cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 11, the cranial accessory nerves, and cranial nerve number 12, the hypoglossal nerve. So these other 4 are emerging from the medulla oblongata. So you know to say that the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, they will form the brainstem. So from the brainstem, you have 10 cranial nerves. Then from the cerebrum, you have 2 nerves. So this is how they are coming in. But in terms of function, the cranial nerves, they relay information between the brain and the parts of the body, primarily to and from regions of the head, the neck, and also including special senses of vision, taste, smell, and hearing. So some of these cranial nerves you've already discussed with Dr. Mshavati, but you know to say they come in with regards to motor function. That's why we are discussing them here. So this table is just summarizing the cranial nerves and the major functions. So it's just more like a summary. So you know to say olfactory is for smell, the optic is for vision, the oculomotor from the name itself, oculomotor meaning the eye movement, is responsible for the eye movement, like I said. So we have upward movement, medial movement, down movement, or downward movement, or up and down. So the oculomotor is responsible for upward movement, medial, downward, up, and in. So because it's innervating the extraocular muscles, so they are able to help in eye movement. And also the trochlear nerve, which is the cranial nerve number 4, is also involved in the movement of the eyeball, especially the down and in movement of the eyeball. Then we have the trigeminal nerve. The trigeminal nerve is a very big nerve, and it has got 3 branches that we are going to be discussing. So it's responsible for touch, the forehead, and the cheek. So touch, sensory, and some components are motor. Then we have the cranial nerve number 6, abducens. So it's responsible for abduction of the eye. So you're talking of to look side to side. So when you're looking side to side, you're using the abducens. Then we have cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve, that is responsible for taste, for the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, and also smell. It's also responsible for smell. Then we have the cranial nerve number 8, which is called the acoustic, and the other name is called vestibulocochlear nerve. It's responsible for hearing and equilibrium, talking of balance, hearing and balance. The glossopharyngeal is responsible for taste, for the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, and also for speech, because it's innervating muscles of the tongue, so it's also involved in speech. Just like I'm speaking right now, I'm using some of the muscles that are innervated by the glossopharyngeal. Then the vagus nerve, we all know, is responsible for slowed heart rate, so the control of the heart rate, and also defecation, the GIT. The spinal accessory shoulder movements. Then the hypoglossal is also tongue movement. So these are the 12 cranial nerves. So these cranial nerves, as they are emerging from the brain tissue, where do they pass? Remember, the brain is closed within the cranium. So this cranium has got openings, which are called foramina or foramen. So from these foramina, this is where you're going to find the cranial nerves emerging from the brain itself. So you can see the coronal section of the cranium exposing the foramina that are housing these cranial nerves as they are emerging from the brain itself. So you can see the cranial fossa that is divided into the anterior, the middle, and the posterior. So this is the front, this is behind. So this is the anterior, and this is the posterior. So when you're looking down here, you're able to appreciate the openings or the foramina that will allow now passage of these cranial nerves. So the cranial nerve number 1 is passing through the cribriform plate. So you have the cribriform plate that will allow the olfactory fibers to go and connect to the olfactory bulb. Then you have the optic canal. The optic canal will allow the passage of cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve, and also the ophthalmic artery. Then we have the superior orbital fissure, where you're going to find the cranial nerve number 3, which is the oculomotor, cranial nerve number 4, the trochlea, cranial nerve number 6, the abducens, and also the ophthalmic nerve. So the cranial nerve number 6 and the ophthalmic nerve and veins, they are found within the superior orbital fissure. This is what is going to allow the passage of these cranial nerves. Then after that, you have the branches of the trigeminal nerve. So you have 3 branches of trigeminal nerve. The first, the V1, which is called the ophthalmic branch, is found within the superior orbital fissure, like we have said. Then the other one, the maxillary nerve, the V2, is found within the foramen rotundum. Foramen rotundum. So within the foramen rotundum, this is where you're going to find the maxillary nerve, which is a branch of the trigemina. It's called the V2. Then from the foramen ovale, this is where you're going to find the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve, mandibular branch. Then from there, you have the foramen spinosum. This is where you just find an artery. You don't find the cranial nerve here. But in foramen lacellum, So you have this foramen lacellum. You also don't find cranial nerves in there. But in internal auditory meatus, the internal auditory meatus is also called internal auditory canal. This is where you're going to find cranial nerve number 7 and cranial nerve number 8. Then down here we have the jugular foramen. The jugular foramen, you're going to find cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal, the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10, and the cranial nerve number 11, which is the accessory nerve. Then down here, you can also appreciate another opening or a foramen, which is called the hypoglossal canal. This hypoglossal canal is housing cranial nerve number 12. And then you can also find some cranial nerves within the foramen magnum. So you have the foramen magnum, where you're going to find the cranial nerve number 11, the spinal cord, the vertebral arteries. So the spinal cord and vertebral arteries are also passing through the foramen magnum. So basically, these are just the openings into the cranium, where you're going to have cranial nerve passing through them to innervate other structures of the body. So this table is basically talking about the same thing as I was explaining here. So you have the location of these cranial nerves, where they're going to emerge from, and you have the actual nerves that are coming from the brain via those openings. So the cribriform plate or olfactory nerve, the optic foramen, this is where you find the optic nerve. Then the superior orbital fissure, you have a lot of cranial nerves coming from there. So you have the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear nerve, the abducens nerve, and the trigeminal nerve V1, which is called the ophthalmic branch. So the ophthalmic branch of trigeminal, the V1, is passing through the superior orbital fissure. Then we have the foramen rotundum. This is where you're going to find the trigeminal nerve V2. This is the maxillary branch, the V2. Then the foramen ovale, this is where you're going to find the trigeminal nerve branch V3, the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve. Then the internal auditory canal, this is where you find the facial nerve and also the vestibulocochlear nerve. So here. Then in the jugular foramen, this is where you're going to find the glossopharyngeal, the vagus nerve, and the accessory nerve. The last one, the hypoglossal canal, is found within the hypoglossal. The hypoglossal nerve is found within the hypoglossal canal. And this table is just summarizing the nuclei, where you have the origin of these nerves. So most of these cranial nerves, like I said, they're coming from the brain stem. So about 10 of them, they're coming from the brain stem. And when you look on this diagram here, you have a number of nuclei that are giving rise to these cranial nerves, emerging from the pons, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So this is the brain stem. So you can appreciate here the olfactory nerve and the optic nerve, their nuclei, they're not being shown here. Why? It's because these, they go direct to the cerebrum. So you have the olfactory nerve that will project to the olfactory bulb. Then optic nerve, they project to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. Then we have the oculomotor nerve. These are coming from the midbrain. So these two are coming from the midbrain, the oculomotor nerve and the trochlear nerve. So you can see in this diagram, you have the midbrain here. So for the oculomotor nerve, it's coming from the oculomotor nucleus. So within the midbrain, you can appreciate the oculomotor nucleus, and you can also appreciate the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. So you have the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. So this is what is giving rise to oculomotor nerve, the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, and the oculomotor nucleus. For the trochlear nerve is cranial nerve number 4. You can see it here, the cranial nerve number 4, the trochlear nerve, is coming from the trochlear nucleus. So from the trochlear nucleus, this is where it's originating from as part of the midbrain. So that's why I'm saying these two cranial nerves are emerging from the midbrain, the oculomotor and the trochlea, and they are going to innervate the extraocular muscles of the eye. Then you have 4 cranial nerves that are emerging from the pons. So you can see the pons here. So the first one is the trigeminal nerve that is emerging from the pons. So the trigeminal nerve, this is a very big nerve. So there are a lot of nuclei that are contributing to the trigeminal nerve. So the first one is the trigeminal nerve nuclei, which are a lot here. You can see that you have the first one being the mesencephalic nucleus. So when you're looking at the trigeminal nerve, you have this nuclei that is extending all the way to the midbrain. That's why it's called the mesencephalic nucleus, because it extends all the way to the midbrain. It's contributing to some fibers that are giving rise to trigeminal nerve. Then on top of that, you have the principal sensory nucleus. So when you check within the pons here, we have the principal sensory nucleus that is also giving rise to some fibers on the trigeminal nerve. Then we also have the spinal trigeminal nucleus. The spinal trigeminal nucleus, you have this group of nuclei that are extending to the spinal cord. So you can see here, from the medulla oblongata all the way to the spinal cord. So these nuclei, they are referred to as spinal trigeminal nucleus or pars caudalis. Pars caudalis. So these are also giving rise to some fibers of the trigeminal nerve. Then on top of that, you have the trigeminal motor nucleus. So the one shown here, you can see you have the trigeminal motor nucleus shown in blue here. It's also giving motor fibers via the trigeminal nerve. So it's a very big nerve. That's why it's a mixed nerve, because it's got sensory and motor fibers at the same time. So this is the one that is going out to divide into the V1, V2, and V3, the optic division, the maxillary division, and the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve. Then the abducens nerve is coming from the abducens nucleus. So you can see the abducens nerve here within the pons is coming from the abducens nucleus. So you can see the abducens nucleus here that is giving rise to abducens nerve. Then we have the facial nerve. The facial nerve is also emerging from the pons. So this facial nerve, you can see it right here. You have the facial nerve here. So where it's coming from? It's coming from the facial motor nucleus. So in this diagram, you can appreciate the facial motor nucleus. Then you can also appreciate the superior salivatory nucleus just here, the superior salivatory nucleus. That's why sometimes when you're looking at nice food, you're able to salivate, because some of the fibers of the facial nerve, they are coming from the superior salivatory nucleus. Then we also have solitary nucleus or nucleus of tractus solitarius. So you know to say that nucleus of tractus solitarius is part of the ventricular formation, then it extends all the way into the midbrain. So you can see that some of the nuclei is also coming from the solitary nucleus that are giving rise to fibers of the facial nerve. Then moving down to vestibulocochlear nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve is also coming from the pons. So you can see it here in the junction between the pons and the medulla. So the pontine medullary junction here, this is where you're going to find the vestibulocochlear nerve. And this vestibulocochlear nerve mainly is coming from 2 nuclei. So you have the vestibular nuclei and the cochlear nuclei, which are subnuclei. So the combination of the two they'll form the vestibulocochlear nucleus. So you have the vestibular nuclei and the cochlea. So the vestibular nuclei is responsible for balance, and the cochlea is responsible for hearing. Then moving down the glossopharyngeal nerve, you see it down here. So these ones now are emerging from the medulla. So there are 4 that are coming from the medulla oblongata. So the first one is the glossopharyngeal nerve that is coming from the nucleus ambiguous. So you can see here in this diagram, you have the nucleus ambiguous that is giving rise to glossopharyngeal nerve. So the glossopharyngeal nerve, some of the fibers are originating from the solitary nucleus, the spinal nucleus or the trigeminal nerve, the lateral nucleus or the vagal trigon, and then the nucleus ambiguous, and also the inferior salivatory nucleus. So all these are giving rise to fibers that will form the glossopharyngeal nerve. Then we also have the vagus nerve, the cranial nerve number 10, that is also coming from the medulla oblongata. So you can see the cranial nerve number 10, which is also big. So the cranial nerve number 10, you can see in this diagram, is coming from the dorsal nucleus of the vagus nerve. So you have dorsal motor vagal nucleus. So this is also called dorsal nucleus of the vagus nerve. Then you have also the nucleus ambiguous. So the nucleus ambiguous is also giving fibers to the vagus nerve. Then even the solitary nucleus and also the spinal trigeminal nucleus. So all these are giving rise to trigeminal nerve. Then we have cranial nerve number 11, the accessory nerve. So you can see here, the accessory nerve mainly is coming from point of the spinal cord, but extending to the medulla oblongata. So this is called the accessory nucleus. So the accessory nucleus. So the accessory nucleus is the one that is giving rise to the accessory nerve. So it's very simple. Accessory nucleus giving rise to the accessory nerve. Then the last one is the hypoglossal nerve. The hypoglossal nerve is the cranial nerve number 12, which is the last one. So you can see in this diagram, you have the hypoglossal nerve. This hypoglossal nerve is coming from the hypoglossal nucleus. So you can see the hypoglossal nucleus here that is giving rise to hypoglossal nerve. So this diagram was just summarizing the nuclei that are giving rise to the cranial nerves. Okay, so now just a bit of information on each cranial nerve, starting with cranial nerve number 1, which is obvious, the olfactory, because it's more cranial, or it's located on the anterior aspect of the body. That's why it's called cranial nerve number 1. So this cranial nerve number 1, it arises from the olfactory epithelium. So you can see within the nostrils. In the nose, you have the olfactory membrane. In the olfactory membrane, you have the neuroepithelium, because these are the ones that are going to form the sense organs. So you have the olfactory receptors that are found within the olfactory membrane that will give rise now to fibers via the olfactory bulb. You have the olfactory nerve, and it's projecting to the olfactory cortex. And this olfactory cortex, you have a lot of this information that is coming from the olfactory fibers that are projecting to the olfactory tubercle, and you also have peniform cortex, oidal complex, then the interrenal cortex, the hippocampus. All these are responsible for interpretation of the information that is coming from the olfactory nerve fibers. So this you discuss with Dr. Mshawati. So you believe by now that it passes through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. So you can have this is the ethmoid bone of the cranium. Then it has got these foramen openings or holes that will allow the passage of these olfactory fibers. And these fibers run through the olfactory bulb and terminate in the olfactory cortex. And the major function is just by carrying afferent impulses for the sense of smell. So it's responsible for smell. So in function is mainly sensory. So it's not motor, it's mainly sensory. That's why it's part of the special senses. Then the cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve. So it rises from the retina of the eye. From the retina of the eye, this is where it will rise from, and then it will form the optic nerve, the cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve. Then this optic nerve passes through the optic canal and converge at the optic chiasma. So from the optic canal, they emerge at the optic chiasma where you have crossing. So 50% is crossing over to the other side of the body, and then the 50% is maintaining the sides. It's lateral to go and form a synapse within the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. Then you notice they will continue to the thalamus where they synapse within the lateral geniculate of the thalamus. Then from here, the fibers, you can see they are projecting to the visual cortex. So the Brodmann's area number 17 and 18, these are visual cortex. This is where these fibers are projecting to for vision. Then the cranial nerve number 3, this is the oculomotor. From the name itself, oculo, you're talking of the eye, movement. Motor is movement. So the movement of the eye. So you can see the fibers here. Fibers extend from the ventral midbrain. So the ventral midbrain, then they pass through the superior orbital fissure. So you can see they're passing through the superior orbital fissure here. Then they'll go and innervate the extrinsic eye muscles. So they will go and innervate these extrinsic eye muscles that are involved in eyeball movement. So the main function is in raising the eyelid, then directing the eyeball, constricting the iris, and controlling the lens shape. So the latter two functions are parasympathetically controlled. So they're part of the parasympathetic system. Then the parasympathetic cell bodies are located within the ciliary ganglia. So you can see the ciliary ganglia here. This is where you have the cell bodies of these parasympathetic fibers that are innervating the inner structures of the ear, especially the iris and the lens. Okay, this is the same nerve. We can see it's coming from this nuclei here, the Edinger-Westphal nucleus and somatic motor nucleus. You have this somatic motor nucleus and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Then it passes through the superior orbital fissure, then all the way to the extraocular muscles. The trochlear nerve, cranial nerve number 4, and this trochlear nerve is a cranial nerve that carries general sense efferent fibers. So it carries general sense efferent fibers to innervate the superior oblique muscle, which is an extraocular muscle in the orbit. So you can see this superior oblique muscle, which is innervated by the trochlear nerve, so which is motor in function. So it arises in the midbrain and is the only cranial nerve to exit from the superior surface of the midbrain or the brainstem. So it's coming from the midbrain, but it's going to emerge or exit within the brainstem. So the superior surface of the brainstem. So after curving around the midbrain, it enters the inferior surface of the free edge of the tentorium cerebelli. So you have the tentorium cerebelli. So this is where it's going to emerge from. Then it's going to innervate the superior oblique muscle. So it continues in an anterior direction in the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. So cavernous sinus. So you have the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, and then it enters the orbit through the superior orbital fissure, like I've already explained. So it's coming from the trochlear nucleus, then it curves around the midbrain. So you can see it curves around the midbrain. You have the trochlear nerve, then it goes and innervates the superior oblique muscle here. Then cranial nerve number 5, this is a trigemina. It's a big nerve, so you can see where it's coming from. We have those nuclei that we've already discussed. Then to form 3 branches. You have the V1, which is the ophthalmic, the maxillary is V2, the mandibular is V3. So fibers run from the face to the pons via the superior orbital fissure for V1, and the foramen rotundum for V2, and the foramen ovale for V3. So they convey sensory impulses from various areas of the face. That's for V1 and V2, and supplies motor fibers for muscles of mastication. That is for V3, because V3 is the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve. So in function, trigeminal nerve is motor and sensory. So sensory of the face and motor of the muscles of mastication. So it's involved in chewing. So you can see the areas that is supplied by the trigeminal nerve. So the ophthalmic zone, then you have the maxillary zone and the mandibular zone. These we've already covered. Then cranial nerve number 6, which is abducens nerve. Cranial nerve number 6, abducens nerve. The fibers leave the inferior pons and enter the orbit via the superior orbital fissure. And in terms of function, is motor. So motor nerve innervating the lateral rectus muscle. So the lateral rectus muscle is innervated by the cranial nerve number 6, the abducens. So it's involved in abduction of the eye. That's why it's called abducens or abducens nerve. So abducens nerve because it's involved in abduction of the eye. Then you have cranial nerve number 7. This is a facial nerve. It's also a big nerve. It's a mixed nerve, motor and sensory in function. So the fibers leave the pons, travel through the internal acoustic meatus, and emerge through the styromastoid foramen to the lateral aspect of the face. So you can see here, it's emerging from this styromastoid foramen, lateral to the face, lateral aspect of the face. In terms of function, you have motor function and sensory function. So motor function includes the facial expressions. Maybe when you're upset, you're able to tell that you're upset because there is that facial expression as a result of the firing of the facial nerve. Then transmitter of the parasympathetic impulses to lacrimal and salivatory and also salivary glands. So the lacrimal and the salivary glands, they are also innervated by the facial nerve. The salivary glands mainly is the submandibular and the sublingual glands. Then the sensory function is taste from the taste buds of the anterior two-thirds of the tongue. So you can see where it's coming from. This is the facial nerve, the cranial nerve number 7. It's coming from this internal gene. So you have the internal gene here where you have the motor nucleus of the cranial nerve number 7. Then you also have other nuclei that are contributing. So it's both motor and sensory in function. Then cranial nerve number 8. This is the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is very simple because in function is basically sensory. So fibers arise from the hearing and equilibrium apparatus of the inner ear. They pass through the internal acoustic meatus and enter the brainstem at the pons medulla border. So pontine medullary border. This is why you find the vestibulocochlear nerve emerging from the brainstem. So it's a combination of 2 different types of fibers, those that are coming from the vestibular apparatus, giving the vestibular nerve, and those that are coming from the cochlear apparatus, giving the cochlear nerve. So the combination of the vestibular nerve and the cochlear nerve is called the vestibulocochlear nerve. So the 2 divisions, the cochlear involved in hearing, the vestibular balance or equilibrium. So the functions are mainly sensory, with regard to equilibrium and hearing. Cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal, you know to say that the fibers emerge from the medulla or the medulla, and they leave the skull via the jugular foramen and run to the throat. So the cranial nerve number 9 is a mixed nerve with motor and sensory function. The motor function, it innervates parts of the tongue and the pharynx and provides motor fibers to the parotid salivary gland. Sensory function, fibers conduct taste and general sensory impulses from the tongue and the pharynx. So it's both motor and sensory in function. So it's called glossopharyngeal, is because it's innervating the structures of the tongue and the pharynx. So you can see here the glossopharyngeal nerve that is emerging from the medulla oblongata. Then it will form some branches that are innervating the parotid gland, and some of them they're innervating the tongue. So the anterior aspect, the posterior aspect of the tongue, and also the pharynx, the structures of the pharynx, and is also innervating structures of the carotid sinus. This is where you have the baroreceptors. That's why in baroreceptor reflex, the cranial nerve number 9 is involved. Cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve, is a common nerve, and you know to say it's also a big nerve that is also originating from the medulla oblongata. So this is the only cranial nerve that extends beyond the head and neck. So most of these cranial nerves, they are confined within the head region and some of them the neck. But the vagus nerve goes beyond the neck to go into innervate structures of the heart and also structures of the GIT. So fibers emerge from the medulla via the jugular foramen. The vagus is a mixed nerve, and most motor fibers are parasympathetic fibers to the heart, lungs, and visceral organs. Is sensory in function. So the sensory function test, you know, to say that the posterior two-third of the tongue is innervated by, not necessarily the posterior two-third of the tongue, but mainly you're talking of structures of the pharynx, they are also innervated by the vagus nerve. So the structure of the pharynx and some portion of the nasopharynx is also innervated by the vagus nerve. So it's also involved in test. Paralysis may lead to hoarseness, and total destruction is incompatible with life. So if there is damage, a complete damage to the cranial nerve number 10, such patients, they don't survive for a long period of time because it's responsible for a lot of things. You can see here the innervation of the cranial nerve. So structures of the heart, the lungs, the pharynx, it extends all the way to the spleen, the kidney, the stomach, the liver, and the small intestines. The cranial nerve number 9, the accessory cranial nerve, is formed from the cranial root emerging from the medulla and the spinal root arising from the superior region of the spinal cord. Then the spinal root passes upward into the cranium via the foramen magnum. The accessory nerve leaves the cranium via the jugular foramen, and the primary function is motor. So motor in terms of function, so it's innervating those muscles of the neck and the shoulder. So mainly you can see that it supplies fibers to the larynx, the pharynx, the soft palate, and it also innervates trapezius muscle, sternocleidomastoid muscle. So you're talking of neck movement and shoulder movement. The cranial nerve number 11 is involved, the accessory nerve, the accessory nerve. Then the cranial nerve number 10, the last cranial nerve, this is the hypoglossal nerve. The hypoglossal nerve fibers arise from the medulla and exit the skull via the hypoglossal canal. It's going to innervate both the extrinsic and the intrinsic muscles of the tongue, which contribute to swallowing and speech. If damaged, is difficulties in speech and swallowing, inability to protrude the tongue once the hypoglossal nerve is damaged. So you can see it's also coming from the medulla oblongata, then it's going to innervate the intrinsic and the extrinsic muscles of the tongue, then it's passing through the hypoglossal canal. This is cranial nerve number 12, innervating the extra or the extrinsic muscles of the tongue, and at the same time, it's also innervating the intrinsic muscles of the tongue. So it's involved in speech, also swallowing. Okay, so this is the same hypoglossal nerve that is coming from the hypoglossal nucleus, then it will project to muscles of the tongue, the extrinsic and the intrinsic muscles of the tongue. Okay, so that was just a quick recap of cranial nerves. So a revision on cranial nerve, but there was a lot of information. So how do you summarize them? So this is just cranial nerve summary. So these cranial nerves, how can you summarize them? So when I was a student, it was very easy for me to remember these cranial nerve and also to know whether they are sensory or motor by just remembering one word. Okay, so for me, I never used to memorize that song, or to touch, or what nonsense. So for me, I could just remember one word, and I could remember the cranial nerve in order. So I could just remember this word, otaphovigiva. So otaphovigiva. So the otaph with triple O, otaphovigiva. So once I write this word, I could remember all the cranial nerves, their order, and I'll also attach some extra information for you to appreciate whether they are sensory, motor, or mixed nerve. Remember, the classification of these cranial nerves can be classified based on function. So whether they are sensory in function, motor in function, or mixed in function, whereby it's a cranial nerve with both sensory and motor fibers. So otaphovigiva. So you know to say these are 12 cranial nerves. So you know to say the first one is the olfactory. The olfactory is cranial nerve number 1. The second one is optic, cranial nerve number 2. Third one is oculomotor, cranial nerve number 3. Then the first T is the trochlea, cranial nerve number 4. Then you have trigeminal, cranial nerve number 5. Abducens, cranial nerve number 6. Facial nerve, cranial nerve number 7. Vestibulocochlear, cranial nerve number 8. Then you have glossopharyngeal, cranial nerve number 9. The vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10. The accessory nerve, cranial nerve number 11. The hypoglossal, cranial nerve number 12. So otaphovigiva. So you are able to remember. So now how can you remember whether it's sensory or motor in function? So to do that, I'm going to draw here for you to understand. So how I could remember is that the cranial nerves that are involved in special senses, mainly they are sensory because they're just coming from the receptor cells, and there are no muscles around them that are involved maybe in motor function. So you find that most of these cranial nerves that are involved in special senses are sensory in function. So basically there are 3 sensory cranial nerves. I would remember that there are basically 3 purely sensory cranial nerves. So you have cranial nerve number 1, olfactory, and optic. This is also sensory. So let's say S is for sensory. So S is for sensory. Then we use M for motor in terms of function. So motor. Then we use M for mixed nerves, which are sensory and motor. So this one is mixed. It's mixed sensory and motor. So the first cranial nerve is sensory in function, the second one is sensory. And the other one that is sensory is the one that is used in hearing and balance. So the vestibulocochlear nerve is mainly sensory in function. So these are the only three cranial nerves that are purely sensory in function. Then I could also remember that there are four cranial nerves that are mixed, and these which are mixed are bigger cranial nerves. So I could easily remember to say that the trigeminal nerve is very big. So you find that this one is mixed. So it's sensory and motor at the same time. Then the other one is the facial nerve, which is also big. Facial nerve is sensory and motor in function. Then the other one is the glossopharyngeal, the cranial nerve number 9. This one is also sensory and motor in function. The vagus nerve is also big, it's also sensory and motor in function. So there are 4 mixed nerves, there are 3 purely sensory nerves, cranial nerves. Then the rest will be just motor in function. So if you can remember the ones which are sensory, then you also remember the ones which are mixed, which are mainly the trigeminal, the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal, and the vagus. These are mixed. The rest of the cranial nerve are mainly motor in function. So you have the oculomotor nerve, which is motor in function because it's just innervating the extraocular muscles. Then you have the trochlear nerve, which is also motor, it's just innervating the extraocular muscles of the eye. Then you have the cranial nerve number 6, the abducens, is also motor, is only innervating one extraocular muscle, the lateral rectus muscle of the eye. Then you have the cranial nerve number 11. These are just innervating skeletal muscles, the trapezius muscle and sternocleidomastoid muscle. So it's only motor in function. Then the cranial nerve number 12, of course, is motor in function. So it's innervating intrinsic muscles and the extrinsic muscles of the tongue. That's why it's called the hypoglossal nerve. So with this word, otaphovigiva, you are able to remember all the cranial nerve and also in order. So you have the optic, the olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlea, trigemina, abducens, facial nerve, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus nerve, accessory, hypoglossal. Then in terms of function, you know to say that the first 2 are purely sensory and the vestibulocochlear, these are sensory. So you put an S, S, S there. Then the other ones are mixed, the big ones. So you have the trigeminal nerve, which is mixed. Then you have the facial nerve mixed. The glossopharyngeal and the vagus, they are also mixed. The other ones are motor. So by so doing, you're able to remember the order of the cranial nerves and also whether they are sensory, motor, or mixed in function. Okay, so that's it for this lecture.